Hello! In this tutorial I'm going to show two IDs for creating randomized note sequences based on chords and scales, and I'll create a patch that combines those IDs into a single voice. The result will sound something like this. I'll start by creating a chord sequence. For this, let's add the Addr-Seq module by Bogaudio, which is a sequencer that can contain up to 8 steps. You set the value of each of the steps on the knobs. The LED shows which step is active, and the trigger on the clock input will move the sequence along. Now, to make it easier to set the values of the sequence, let's add a quantizer by VCV. We'll connect the sequencer to the quantizer, and now the voltages will be quantized to the nearest note value. For the first step in the sequence, I want DC, so we can leave that at 0 volts. I'll move on to the second step. You see that the LED moved over here. Let's change this value until it reaches an F. The third step will be a G. And the fourth step will be a C again. So we can leave that. Move the selection back to the first step. And move the number of steps until it says 4. This will give us a simple 1-4-5-1 progression. Next we'll need a clock to drive the sequencer. I'll use the clocked module by Impromptu, leave it at 120 BPM, which will come out of the master clock output. And then these 3 clocks can be modified with the knobs over here. I'll use the first clock for the sequencer. And now you can see that it starts moving through the chord sequence. But I don't want it to move on each beat, I want it to move slower. So let's right click on this knob and set it to -8. And you'll see that it divides the clock rate by 8, and the sequence moves slower. Now I want to get the notes of the chords in that sequence. For this, let's add the dIKT module by Bidoo. This module expects the root note of a chord on its input, so we'll use a quantizer output for that. And over here at the top of the module, you specify the scale and scale type you want the chords to be generated in. You can change the scale from C to D and so on, and the scale type from Ionian, which is a major scale, to for example Aeolian, which is a minor scale. I'll leave it on a C major. And now these outputs give us the root, 3rd, 5th and 7th chord notes, and the 9th, 11th and 13th tensions. So we can use those notes as input for a note sequence. To create that note sequence, I'll add 2 modules by NullPath, the Entangle and the Collapse modules. The Entangle is a router with 9 inputs and 9 outputs, and the Collapse is a switch with 9 inputs and 1 output. That 1 output will be what produces the notes for our oscillator. But first let's construct a sequence on Entangle. We'll take the root, 3rd, 5th and 7th note of the active chord, and the 9th tension can also sound nice within a sequence. Now all of these are close to the same octave range, but I also want some higher notes in there. So to send some of these notes into a higher octave, I'll add an Ocd module by VCV. You give this module a note voltage on its input, and then the output will move that note to a different octave, depending on what is specified here above. Let's set this 1 octave higher. So now any note on the input will become an octave higher on the output. But I want to move multiple of these notes, so I could add multiple Ocd modules. But since this module is polyphonic, I can also do this by sending multiple signals to it. I'll add a MergeSplit4 by Grande, connect the root, 3rd and 5th notes to the merge section, and connect the merge to the Ocd. And now you can see those 3 inputs coming into the module. And when we send the output to the split section, you get those same notes 1 octave above, so 1 volt higher. Let's use these in our sequence, which leaves 1 more input available. And since the root of a chord is such a strong note, I'll add another one of those. So that completes our sequence over here. Let's connect them with the inputs of the Collapse module. All 9 of them. Now the Collapse can switch between those inputs and send that to its output. We'll need to send a clock to the module. Let's use the master clock for this. And now you can see that the Collapse starts moving. but it looks to be moving at random. This is because over here, the mode is set to select chance. In this mode, the weights over here will define how likely it is that the collapse will switch to that input, but I don't want a completely random sequence. So let's set collapse to the next mode, which is skip chance. And now you can see that collapse starts moving from top to bottom, and again from top to bottom. In this mode, the weight value specifies how likely it is that collapse will either skip or play the step in the sequence. At 1, the step will always play, and at 0, the next time the sequence comes by, it will always skip this step. Somewhere in the middle, it will be a 50-50 chance that it will play or skip that step. Let's already start playing this sequence the way it is now. I'll add a dark energy module by Geodesics, which is an oscillator, and connect the volt per octave input to the collapse output. I'll also add a Mix4 module by Bogaudio at this point. Connect the mixer to the audio output and send the dark energy module into the first channel on the mixer. But it is playing continuously and I want the notes to be separated a bit. So let's press this button, which enables the internal VCA of the module. Now every time a different note is detected on the input here, an internal volume envelope is triggered. And on this knob, you can specify the decay time of that envelope. It's a bit short right now, so let's change that to 400 milliseconds, which makes the notes sound out a bit more. Of course, this static note sequence will quickly become boring to listen to, so let's start using the features of the Entangle and Collapse modules to make it a bit more interesting. First I'm going to send a clock signal into the Entangle module. Each time that a trigger is sent to this clock input, Entangle will pick 2 of its inputs and swap them on the output. Now these 2 have swapped places, which you can see by the lines that connect the inputs and the outputs. So over time, the sequence will keep changing. But I don't want this change to happen on a fixed clock. I want some randomization in there. In order to get that, I'll add a Bernoulli gate module. You give this module a trigger signal on its input, and each time it receives a trigger on the input, it will send it at random to either the A or the B output. And how often it sends them to either of these depends on this probability knob. At 50%, there's an equal chance that it goes to either of the outputs. Turn the knob to the left and it will be more likely to go to the A output. Turn it to the right and it will be more likely to go to B. So if I set this probability to 5%, then 95% of the triggers will go to A and 5% to B. So let's connect that to the Entangle clock input, so that the order is changed every now and again. Let's turn our attention to the Collapse module. To bring variation in here, we can start playing with the weight knobs. And we could also send values to their CV inputs. But there is also this randomize steps button. When you click it, all the weights have been randomized. Click it again and you get new random values. There is also a trigger input for this button. Let's hook that up to the bottom part of the Bernoulli gate. The bottom part does the same as the top part, but if there is no input provided with, it will instead use the input of the top part. So we can set a different probability value here, let's say 2.5%, and that will trigger the Collapse module to change the step weights on the sequencer. So now we have randomization coming from Entangle and Collapse. There is one more item I want to bring some variation into here. Let's move these modules a bit and add another Bernoulli gate. Now instead of sending the clock directly into Collapse, I'm first gonna send it through the Bernoulli gate. Set the probability to 75% and connect that to the clock input. So now 3 out of 4 clock triggers will go through the B output and onto the Collapse clock input, which makes the sequencer take a break every now and again before it continues. With the note sequence now in place, we're going to make it sound a bit better by adding some effects. The first effect will be provided by the chronoblob delay module. Connect the output of the dark energy module with the right input of the delay. Connect the delay to the output mixer And since the delay has stereo output, I'll pan the first channel to the left and the second channel to the right. Since I'll make a couple of changes to the delay module settings, I'm going to set it to crossfading mode so that the changes get applied a bit smoother. First thing to do is to sync the delay with our main clock. But that doesn't sound that interesting. So instead of going at single speed, I'll move the delay to 1.5, which gives a bit of an offbeat in the delay sound. Right now, the delay is in dual mode, which means that anything coming in on the right side is also repeated on the right, and the same for the left side. If we change the delay to ping pong mode, something coming in on the right will first be repeated on the left, then back on the right, left, right, and so on. Let's also change the mix between dry and wet to 35%, which means that the delays get less volume compared to the original incoming signal. Right now the incoming signal is only hooked up to the right input. Let's change that by using the Tàin switch by Instruo. This switch has a 2 input to 1 output section at the top and a 1 input to 2 outputs on the bottom. We'll connect the dark energy module to that 1 input and connect the 2 outputs to the right and left inputs of the delay module. Now you can see that the dark energy output goes through the input and onto the output that's connected to the right delay. And when you press this button here, the input instead goes to the left side. Press it again to switch again. There's also an input for that switch. So let's take the clock of the collapse module, Ctrl click it to duplicate that cable and connect it to the switch trigger. So now every time that the collapse module moves to a new node, that node will go to the other side of the delay input. With the delay now set up, there is of course one more effect that's pretty much required in any of my patches. So let's add some reverb. We'll use the Reverb2 module by Search XT. Connect the delay to the reverb. I'm first going to change the preset on the reverb because I know this will cause a loud pop on the audio output. Change it to the Now That's Enough preset. Send the reverb into the mixer. And the preset I selected is a send effect by default, which means the mix value is set to 100%, so only the reverb signal is coming out of the module. Let's change that by reducing the mix to 33%. And now we get a combination of the original signal and the reverb signal. With the effects chain out of the way, let's turn our attention back to the dark energy module. This module contains a combination of 2 oscillators, a left oscillator and a right oscillator, each with their own tuning, self-modulation and cross-modulation settings. It's also possible to switch one or both of these oscillators to LFO mode. If you press this button twice until the yellow low LED lights up, that oscillator will become an LFO, which means that in this case the main sound will be coming from the left oscillator, and the right oscillator will modulate that sound over time. Let's turn down the speed of that LFO even more by tuning it 2 octaves lower, and now we can start shaping the sound a bit more. Set some self-modulation on the right oscillator. Let the right oscillator do some cross-modulation on the left oscillator, which you really start to hear since the left oscillator is the main sound source. And then we'll also add some self-modulation on that left oscillator. And some cross-modulation. That sounds a lot more interesting. But I also want it to change over time, which can be done with these 2 input CVs for the self and cross modulation. Let's move these modules and add an Oct module by Instruo to the patch. This module has 9 LFO outputs, all set to a different rate. Let's slow down the overall speed a bit to 0.125. And then we can use the LFO outputs to modulate the dark energy module. One for the self modulation, and another for the cross modulation. Now if we press this button until both of these LEDs light up, then the impact of the input CV will be combined with what we set on the knobs above and below. And by opening these knobs a bit, the amount of self-modulation and cross-modulation applied to the oscillators will change over time, dependent on the value coming from the LFO. And with that, the first idea for creating a note sequence is complete. The idea for the second part is inspired by one of the instructional videos that you can find on the Instruo page, where detailed explanations are given about how you can use each of their modules. I can highly recommend the videos on their channel if you're interested in deep dives into modular patching in general and using their modules specifically. The idea is to use an LFO as source for your notes. First, let's mute the voice that we already have and start adding in an oscillator for the LFO. Since the idea comes from an Instruo video, I'll use Instruo modules, like the Ts-L, from which we'll use the triangle output. To help visualize what we're doing, I'll also add an oscilloscope by count modula and connect the triangle output to it to visualize it. We'll switch the Ts-L into LFO mode, slow down the time on the oscilloscope a bit, and reduce the speed of the Ts-L to 0.125. Now to turn this LFO signal into notes, we'll start by adding a sample and hold. Let's take the Instruo Tàgh module, which we can give a signal on its input, and capture values from that on the output each time a clock is received. Let's hook it up to the Ts-L, send the output to the yellow input on the oscilloscope, and then we send in the main clock. You'll see on the oscilloscope that Tàgh updates to the current value of the LFO each time it receives a clock signal. Let's slow down the oscilloscope a bit more. And now if we change the rate of the LFO, you'll see that the yellow signal also starts to move differently. As we speed up the LFO, it starts jumping more erratically. This sample and hold output is a random value, however. It won't correspond to notes. In order to do that, we'll have to add a quantizer. Let's add in the Harmonàig module by Instruo. Connect it to Tàgh. And now we can set the notes we want here at the bottom. You can look at these as piano keys, so we want to disable all the black keys and end up with a C major scale. And now the root, third, fifth and seventh output will contain notes from that scale. But we're only interested in the root note here, so let's play that note using a Neóni module. Send the Harmonàig output to the Neóni volt per octave input and connect the wavefold output of the Neóni to the mixer. But it's only playing a single note right now. This is because on the Harmonàig you need to open up this input attenuator. When you do that, you specify how much the input signal should make the notes move up and down. You basically specify how much the input signal should move the note values away from the basic C value. You can make it go into more extreme values, but we'll keep it on a more modest 0.27 here. Now if you slow down the input LFO, you'll see that the notes generated move at a slower rate up and down. And when you speed up the LFO, the notes also start to move differently again. Right now, the Neóni output is constantly playing. And unlike the dark energy module, the Neóni has no internal VCA, so instead we'll have to set that up ourselves. Let's add in the Cèis module, which is an envelope generator with a Tàgh, decay, sustain and release. We'll need a trigger for this envelope, so for that we can use this gate output on the Harmonàig, which will trigger anytime a new note is detected. And since Cèis is in trigger mode, this will trigger the attack and release stages. The most logical next step would be to add a VCA to control the volume, but another idea I first encountered in an Instruo instructional video is that you can also use a filter instead. I'll use the I-o47 module, connect Neóni to the input and send the low pass output to the mixer. Now if you open and close a filter, you can also hear a volume-like effect. So if I set the filter to a low value like 0.2, I can cause it to open by using the FM input. Connect the Cèis output to it, open up the attenuator, I'll use .64 here, and now we can hear those notes playing again. Let's decrease the attack a bit. And make the release a bit longer. That sounds better. Coming back to the speed of the input LFO, it would be nice if we could modulate that over time, which is of course possible by connecting the volt per octave input to an output of the Oct LFO. And now as the value of the Oct LFO changes, so does the rate of the Ts-L LFO output, and thus the pattern of the note changes. Let's get rid of the oscilloscope now, and scroll up again. With the second note pattern now set up, I wanted to go through the same effects as the other note pattern, mix them together into one voice. So let's add in a mixer module. We'll use this one by Search XT. Connect the notes that we created earlier to the first mixer left and right inputs. Connect the mixer output to the delay module. And then we send the Neóni output to the second mixer input. Unmute that voice again on the main mixer. And now we can open up the volume for that second channel. And you can hear those new notes coming in, but they don't really punch through, even though they are at full volume already. Let's mute the first channel and go back to the Neóni module. There is a reason I used its wavefold output, because if you then open up the wavefold effect on the module, you quickly get something that does punch through the mix. So let's set the wavefold to a small value like 0.1, and now we can use a CV input and attenuator to modulate the wavefolding over time. Let's take another output of Ocd, open up the attenuator to 0.64, and now when the LFO input is high, you get a harsher sound, and as it goes lower, it becomes softer. We'll unmute the first mixer channel again, and the Neóni input is even a bit too loud now, so let's lower that by 7.5 dB. And that's more balanced. But it would be nice if we could make these two channels fade in and out, as if they're talking to each other. To do this, we can use one of the modulation inputs of the mixer, provided with an LFO input, and then when you click the button above it, you'll see it turns blue, after which you can specify which knobs this modulation source should influence. So let's click on the volume knob of the first channel and start moving it up to about 0.45, so that it will influence that volume. And then click on the volume knob of the second channel and start moving that down to about -0.25, so that that volume is influenced in the other direction compared to the first one. Now click on the blue button again to leave editing mode, but the volume of the first channel is already at max, so it cannot be modulated any higher. To fix that, let's remove 5 dB from each of the channels. So -12.5 on the second channel, and now both channels have room to move both up and down in volume. And you'll see blue sections that indicate that the volume is being modulated. And they end up slowly fading into each other. There is one more thing missing to complete this tutorial patch, and that is a bass voice. So let's add another dark energy module, hook it up to our quantized sequencer output, reduce the volume on the mixer a bit to -13.5, and connect the module output to the mixer. Now our bass needs to be low, so let's go 2 octaves lower, and to make it a bit gritty, I'll send the right oscillator an additional octave lower. Let's add some self-modulation on the left oscillator, and the right oscillator. I'm not going to add cross modulation on the left oscillator, but will add a little to the right one, which makes it come to life a bit more. Let's also bring some variation into the self-modulation. Set its level to 0.25 so that the sound changes over time. But it's still sounding a little thin right now. Let's fix that with a chorus by Search XT, which is a stereo module. So let's also lower the volume on this channel, connect the dark energy to the chorus input, and the output to the mixer. We'll use the fullness preset on the chorus, which broadens the bass sound a bit. And with that, the tutorial patch is now complete. It contains 2 different IDs for generating note sequences, one based on chords, the other based on an LFO source and a scale, and both of them going through their own oscillator chain, after which they come together to create one voice and pass through some effects. As usual, there are a lot of directions that you can take from here. For me, this tutorial patch was the start of my FRM TRL patch, which is short for From Tutorial. If you look at the second row in that patch, you'll see the Instruo module chain, and the last row contains a chain with Entangle and Collapse and a mixer, delay and reverb modules. I did a bit of tweaking on how everything worked and added a way to make the full voice fade in and out of the mix, but the biggest part of that voice still works the same way as in this tutorial. I did change the chord sequence and added additional voices to the patch to bring some additional atmosphere into the mix. So if you're interested in seeing one possibility of what can be done starting from this tutorial, I invite you to go and take a listen to it. But for now, thank you for watching and happy patching.